Mary's cool, blonde beauty when she presented a petition for the restoration of her husband's forfeited lands. He paid ardent suit to her, but she steadfastly refused to become his mistress, saying that she did account herself too base to be his wife, so she did think herself too good to be his harlot. She remained steadfast in her resistance to his advances, even when, so legend claims, he held a dagger to her throat. The king's passion was so great, however, that he persuaded her into a secret marriage at Grafton Regis on the 1st of May 1464, and declared her to be his queen some months later. Elizabeth was crowned at Westminster Abbey on the 26th of May 1465 with considerable pomp. The sudden arrival of this stately but aloof unknown caused much resentment at court, notably with the king's brother Richard, Duke of Gloucester, later Richard III, who heartily disliked his new sister-in-law and showed it at every opportunity. accession and marriage to her eldest daughter, Elizabeth, was reinstated as Queen Dowager in 1486, but in the following year her lands were forfeited for her alleged perfidy in attending Richard's court in 1484, and she was obliged to retire in reduced circumstances to Bermondsey Abbey, where she died on the 8th of June 1492. VII, she again acquiesced willingly, probably for the sake of her mother and sisters, who were well nigh destitute. As queen she led a dull existence, albeit a comfortable and often splendid one. No contemporary portraits of Elizabeth have survived. Her tomb effigy depicts a figure of serenely calm majesty, but the carved wooden funeral effigy, partially restored, and the portrait in the National Portrait Gallery, probably a late 16th century copy of a contemporary original, both give the impression of a stolid, plump-cheeked, pouting woman, listless and cow-eyed. Her whole life was in fact dominated by women of stronger character. Her mother, of whom in later life she does not seem to have been particularly fond, her formidable grandmother, proud Cis, the old Duchess of York, and her mother's sworn enemy, and most of all her mother-in-law, the energetic, forthright, blue-stocking Countess of Richmond and Derby, with whom she got on remarkably well. Elizabeth's health was tolerably good for the period. 3 of her 7 children died in childhood, 9 days after the birth. Of her last baby, she died in the Tower of London on the 11th Duchess of Norfolk and the Marchioness of Dorset. Fortunately, the baby was a strong, healthy child. Anne Boleyn's disgrace and execution led to Elizabeth being declared illegitimate by Act of Parliament and deprived of her place in the succession before she was 3 years old. For some years she was kept away from court and was provided with neither gown, nor girdle, nor petticoat, nor no manner of linen. A later act reinstated her, and the kindness of her stepmother, Catherine Parr, brought her back to court, where she shared the tutors of her half-brother Edward, later Edward VI, becoming proficient in Latin, French, Italian, in which she was coached by Castiglione, and some Greek. She also had some leanings towards the Protestant faith, although she was by no means committed at this time. In July 1553, Elizabeth entered London at Mary's side and attended her coronation in October in the company of her one-time stepmother, Anne of Cleves. In the following year, she refused to take part in Sir Thomas Wyatt's rebellion, but was nevertheless, at the instigation of Stephen Gardiner, imprisoned in the Tower of London. As she landed at the Tower's Traitor's Gate, she announced firmly, "Here lands as true a subject, being prisoner, as ever landed at these stairs." She was later removed to Woodstock and then to Hatfield House in Hertfordshire. It was there that she received the news of Mary's death and her own accession, by tradition, while sitting reading under a tree in the grounds of Hatfield House, although it seems unlikely that she would have been thus engaged in the middle of an English November. "This is the Lord's doing, and it is marvellous in our eyes," was the scriptural quotation with which she greeted the news. Elizabeth's entry into London occasioned great popular rejoicing. Like her father, she loved display and magnificence of dress, and soon proved she could stir the people by her rhetoric and proud, masterful manner. She took up residence at Richmond Palace, the fittings of which included one of the first working water closets in England. Elizabeth's coronation took place at Westminster Abbey on the 15th of January 1559, a date settled on after Elizabeth consulted Dr. John Dee, the famous astrologer, for the most propitious date for the event. The See of Canterbury had been vacant since the death of Cardinal Pole, and the only bishop who could be found to perform the ceremony was Owen Oglethorpe, Bishop of Carlisle. At her anointing, the Queen complained that the oil used was grease and smelled ill, and expressed further displeasure when the bishop elevated the host at the consecration. She withdrew to a private pew while this rite was enacted. One highlight of the festivities was the burning of a wicker effigy of the Pope, stuffed with cats. Elizabeth had decided to re-establish the Protestant faith, and set about doing so with dogged resolution. Successive popes would thunder against her to no avail, and it was quite useless for Pius V to excommunicate her in 1570 and declare her subjects absolved of their allegiance to her. Pope Sixtus V, indeed, was so impressed with Elizabeth's firmness of purpose, he exclaimed, history. It was not without its moments of controversy, however, with repeated clashes with Spain and dissension within her own court. One deed that was felt to reflect especially poorly upon her was the execution of her cousin, Mary Queen of Scots, in 1587, after 18 years' captivity in England, in Elizabeth's defence. However, it is impossible to deny that Mary did represent a threat and was the hope of the Catholic party that intrigued on her behalf, intrigues that culminated in the Bebington plot of 1586 to kill Elizabeth and put Mary on the throne. Certainly, Elizabeth took no pleasure in ordering the execution, and when news of the Queen's death reached London, her countenance changed, her words faltered, and with excessive sorrow she was in a manner astonished, insomuch as she gave herself over to grief, putting herself into mourning weeds, and shedding abundance of tears. Drake's defeat of the Spanish Armada in the following year was the crowning glory of Elizabeth's reign, and consolidated her reputation as a strong monarch, as emphasised by herself in one of her most famous addresses in 1588. I know I have but the body of a weak and feeble woman, but I have the heart and stomach of a king, and a king of England too. This victory was made possible by the maritime experience of England's seamen, who had been encouraged by their Queen to seek new wealth overseas. The Elizabethan age was one of adventure and discovery. Hawkins, Gossips were even heard to suggest she had been murdered so that Dudley would be free to marry the Queen. Others claimed that Elizabeth had borne Dudley a child, though such scandal-mongers risked having their ears cut off for spreading such rumours if brought before the authorities. It was said that Elizabeth had given Essex meanwhile a ring, which she told him to send to her if he ever needed her forgiveness for any wrong when he was subsequently placed under sentence of death. He is reputed to have sent the ring to her, confident of a pardon, but it was intercepted by an enemy, and he was executed. Legend has it that for the rest of her life, the heartbroken Queen would burst into tears whenever his name was mentioned. Another favourite was Sir Walter Raleigh, their relationship developing after the young Raleigh, hoping for advancement, scratched on a window pane at court, "Fain would I climb, but that I fear to fall," to which the Queen appended the celebrated rejoinder, "If thy heart fail thee, climb then not at all." Elizabeth enjoyed generally good health, although she had black teeth, consequence of her fondness for sugar, and had to powder her face white after contracting near fatal smallpox in 1562. She attempted to reduce the resultant scarring by wiping her own urine on her skin. She recovered and lived another 41 years, determined to conceal from the world the fact that she was aging. She had all the mirrors in her palace removed, so that she would not have to look at her own reflection. In the middle of January 1603, Elizabeth, who at 69 had attained a greater age than that reached by any of her predecessors, was suffering from a cold when she removed from Whitehall to Richmond Palace. She recovered, but fell ill again at the end of February, with severe tonsillitis, which was relieved when a small abscess broke. She had no appetite, however, and complained of bad dreams. On the 18th of March, she became very ill again, but refused to take to her bed, lying instead on a heap of pillows piled on the floor. When Cecil urged her to go to bed, she showed a last flash of her great spirit in her reply, little man, must is not a word to use to princes." Elizabeth died at 3 o'clock in the morning on Wednesday the 24th of March, 1603. A messenger at once set out for Scotland to convey the news of his accession to the new king, James I. Elizabeth was buried in Westminster Abbey in the same vault as her half-sister Mary I. The tomb erected above it bears Elizabeth's effigy only, but the following epitaph was inscribed by order of James I. "Regno consortes et urna, hic abdomicus Elizabetha et Maria Sorores in spe resurrectionis, consorts both in throne and grave, here rest we two sisters, Elizabeth and Mary, in hope of our resurrection." Okay, I'm going to leave it there. I hope you enjoyed the histories of the various royal Elizabeths. This has been Kate at the Library of Whisper saying I shall see